The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Hey there, everybody. This is Propaganda Panda once again, here to announce our next speaker for this next training. Today we have Jeff Foley. He's a project leader at OWASP, part of the AMass project. Jeff, how you doing?
Good. How's everybody?
Everyone's on mute, so they can't tell you. But are you in our Discord server, Jeff?
I am.
So for anybody who has questions and out there that they want to get some clarification on something that Jeff talks about, or you just have a question about something in general, please go ahead and join the Track 1 Red Team channel in our Discord server. That's where we're going to be monitoring and looking at all those questions. If you put questions in the GoToWebinar, we may get to it, we might not get to it, but our focus is going to be on the Discord server. So please, and if you don't know how to get there, just go to the website, jungle.io, and then take a look at the Discord servers, and you'll have the invite link there. But Jeff, feel free to continue to introduce yourself, talk a little bit about yourself, and then we can get started with this training.
Sounds good. I'm just responding to something someone said. Yeah. So, and thank you for the great introduction. Yes, I'm Jeff Foley. I'm the project leader at OWASP for the AMass project. And today, I was going to cover a variety of topics that I've been told in the past people wanted to know more about, or they felt maybe there's not clear documentation on some of these features. I've also been told, AMass is some people have said a bit of a beast, so there's a lot to potentially learn. And I'd like to see people getting more value out of some of the powerful features that we've implemented. But at the same time, I was going to start kind of at ground zero, so hopefully, if some people haven't touched it before, they could get started with what we're going to cover today. But it's going to come pretty quick. It might seem a little bit like fire hosing. It could lead to additional questions. I'll try to leave time at the end, so hopefully we can hit up some of those questions, but we'll see how it goes. I probably will not be able to do this and keep track of what people are saying in the Discord at the same time. So maybe if we could do a lot of the questions at the end, that might make better use of the time that we have available today. All right.
Yeah, I was gonna tell you, Jeff, don't feel like you have to monitor Discord at all. Omar is there to help you in case someone has any questions that are like, super urgent. So I'm just focused on the training. That'll be awesome.
All right, great. Okay, so I usually at least start with a little bit of a summary of what is AMass, in case, like I said, you've never heard of it, you wanted to find out today. So it's in-depth asset discovery and network mapping. So that could be for red team or blue team purposes. It's just so that if you want to see what your exposure on the internet is, it's a pretty powerful tool for, you could start with nothing but a domain name and end up finding out about assets you were not aware are exposed to the internet, which in my experience working with corporations so far, most of the time when we run them against these corporations, that's exactly what happens, is they end up finding out there's all sorts of things in their namespace exposed on the internet that they didn't know about and haven't been tending to. And in my opinion, of course, which I think is the popular opinion, you can't protect it if you don't know it's there, right? And I've always found that to be a pretty important step in any security program. Let's make sure we understand exactly what what I call the battlefield looks like, so that we can either protect it properly or plan our attack properly. So that's always been the goal of this project, is let's help everyone become a little better at doing this. So where do you find this project. Let me, again, assuming you haven't used it before. So if you just Google OWASP AMass, the first thing that should come up is our repo on GitHub. And so I would definitely recommend to everyone take the time to read what we have here. Some of your questions could be answered right here. You know, and if not, we're definitely interested in hearing what you perhaps think should be here that would have saved you time or anything like that. Don't hesitate to come to our Discord. Please make that your first stop, and then speak with us about honestly anything that comes to mind. But there's some pretty good information here about getting started with installation, where to find the documentation on how to use this, some of our preferences on, you know, how do you interact with the project team if you want to be involved or you just have questions, where to go if you are referencing this and you would like us to recognize that, and so on. So, you know, this is definitely the place to go. This is where the action is happening, that and the Discord server. As far as installation, you have quite a few options. If you're new to this, I would recommend just go to the latest release and probably just start with, you know, grab the pre-built executable appropriate for your operating system, because the other options are likely to come with complications that could, you know, get you on the wrong track. I would say just get the executable, start playing with it, get familiar with it. Then you can worry about, you know, what's the easiest way to deal with like an upgrade path or things that might lead to conveniences in the future. And I would check this frequently. You know, this is updated pretty regularly with fixes, and about every 30 days we try to make a major, or I guess it's a minor version update. So it's a pretty active project, and the fixes can be very, you know, have high impact on your experience. I mean, like as you can see here, this one was released within the last 24 hours. There are, let me show you something real quick. So if we go back and you go to the installation guide, there are package managers out there that stay on top of this pretty well. So as you can see, Cali, you know, FreeBSD, BlackArch, there's the Arc, yeah. So there's a handful of these OSs and their package managers where they're pretty up to date on the version you should be using. And of course, that's probably the easiest way to get your hands on this. But these are not maintained by this project. Those OSs, or the people responsible for those package managers, pretty much have responsibility for that. So the only ones that this project has control over is the Homebrew installation and the Snapcraft package manager, which I would actually say, unless you're only going to use the most basic features, don't use this. It comes with some heavy constraints that it puts on your use of the executable, and it can reduce what you're able to do with it, which they, you know, impose for security purposes. But unless, you know, if you want to take full advantage of it, I'd say either just go get the executable or use one of these other third-party packages. All right, so with that, I think we can, let's take a quick look at documentation just so that people know where to find these things. Right, so all of the documentation is under this directory right here. I would definitely say read this real quick. It's very short. It's good to know your options. Take a look at these. The user guide is a little boring, but it has quite a lot of the details. This tutorial is really great. I would say take the time to read that. It'll probably save you some trouble getting started. And then down the road, if you plan on taking advantage of scripting, definitely look at this. This is where all the details are located for how to use the scripting engine. All right, so I think that covers some of the things I was hoping to have as an introduction. If there's been any good questions that are relevant to this, I would say if you want to let me know about it real quick, I could hit that up before I move on to basic usage. Someone's typing, but I'm not sure if that's an answer to my question. All right, while I'm waiting, I'm gonna move along to, so one question I have is, can everyone see this terminal clear enough? Let me type a couple things. Like, is this large enough for everyone to read this? Okay, so one thing you probably should know is, so Cali, like I mentioned, or I think I showed in the information about installation, has its own package for this tool. And when I just executed this, that's what it ran. So this is one version behind her. It's the version that the table indicated Cali currently supports. But I have installed the latest version in this directory. So if you're ever wondering, well, how do I know which one I'm running, or is this the one that I tried to install, or is it the one that's been installed already? This is how you figure it out. It also I think it tells you which version each time you run it. So, but just as a heads up, that's how you do that. So, some people come and ask us, well, what are the differences between the various modes? How do I know which way to run this that suits my needs best? So I'm going to go over a few details about, well, how does this work, and what do some of these terms mean that get tossed around about AMass, like the mode you're running in. So to get started, it's important that people realize that many of the tools that do similar, like subdomain enumeration or DNS enumeration out there are very, they just go out and get the data. A lot of them don't even do DNS enumeration. They just go out and get the data passively from various data sources. They pull it down, and then they just print out pretty much the unique results, so that you're just getting a list of unique findings for the target domain. But and that's what AMass does if you run it like this. If you say passive and then give it your target organization or domain, then in that case, the only thing it's going to do is what I just described. It's going to go out to all the available data sources. It's going to query for that, and then pull the data back, and it prints it out, and then it's finished. There's perhaps a few little things in between that it does, but not really worth mentioning at this point in time. But you can see from the fact that I ran it with the source flag, it's also telling us where did it get it from, which I find pretty helpful. So it will do this and make sure that it's received all the results that it can get from these data sources, and then pretty soon you'll see it says, all right, there's nothing left to do, quit. So in my opinion, though, this is just the beginning of possibilities available to you for how to get this type of information. It's what I used to refer to people when I was first developing this as like the trampoline stage, or the it's what gets the ball rolling. It's where do we begin? So you have to start somewhere with, okay, we have this domain name. So what do we first do with it to get some names so we can start poking around and finding more? And these data sources are the place to begin, where you can just say, hey, look, I've got this domain name, give me something to start chewing on. So, but I honestly rarely find myself using this. It's the bare minimum. Instead, if you allow AMass to run in what I just considered normal mode, or it's not passive, it's not active in the sense that we're sending traffic directly to the target organization. It's in between, and what I mean by that is it's sending DNS requests, but I would kind of argue that that's not active, at least in my opinion, in the sense that you're sending the DNS request to the resolvers, and since we're sending it with the flag saying we would prefer that you don't tell the authoritative name server where this came from, although not all resolvers will adhere to that request. And then the resolvers send the traffic to the authoritative name server that's controlled by the target organization. I would say that's not really active. I mean, it is in the sense that there's the potential that your traffic could be received by that organization, but it's very like light, or far less likely to draw attention to your activity. And many organizations, I find this kind of funny actually, many organizations don't notice it at all, which I find concerning. But with AMass, active means that when you find something, it will start to send traffic to those systems or assets. So for instance, it will attempt to reach out to the asset and see if it can pull TLS certificates directly off a web server, if there is one. If it finds name servers, it will attempt to do zone transfers, things that are far more attention getting. You're going to draw attention to your activity by doing that than just making DNS requests. But this is how I use it usually. I say, I don't identify a mode, because your alternative, there's passive, normal, what I call normal, and then active. Like I said, right now, that just means you're sending additional traffic to the target when the opportunity arises. So this will start by doing the same thing that passive mode performs, which is go out to the data sources, grab the data that they're willing to give us. But then it starts this cyclic process where it takes those names, it resolves them, it gets IP addresses. It then attempts to do reverse DNS sweeps on IP addresses around the IPs that we just learned about. It also will take the names that were successfully resolved, and it will create permuted names that are similar to those names and see if those will work. If you turn on brute forcing, which I'll show you more about later, it will attempt to do brute forcing on the domain and the subdomains. So some of those features aren't available if you're in purely passive mode, because there's no DNS resolution. or ability to query the names. So we have no feedback to say, are these names legitimate or still in use? And therefore, there's no way to do the brute forcing. There's no way to then, get IPs to then investigate the infrastructure further. And that's what will happen if you allow AMass to use these additional features that, like I said, many other tools don't support. All right, so there's no need to really wait for this. So as you see, when I'm, say, tired of waiting for this, you're seeing I'm just hitting Control-C to interrupt the process, which it will catch, and then assuming it can wrap up what was going on quick enough, it will finish the process like it normally would by taking what it currently knows and then giving you the summary information at the bottom. But the right way to do this, if you would like to put a limit on how long it takes for your enumeration process to complete, would not be to do what I just did for lots of reasons, right? One being, it'd be difficult to script that probably, or not convenient. And it actually is not as clean within the AMass program to do it the way I just did. The better way would be to use a built-in feature that we have. So let me show you. So if we go to enum-h to get the help information, right here we can see the timeout option. So this lets you specify a number of minutes that you would like this to run before you just say, okay, look, enough is enough. Maybe that's, depending on the size of your target, maybe that's a few hours or something like that. But this way, you can be guaranteed that at that point, within the enumeration process, it will cleanly terminate the activity and conclude the entire process, or wrap it up, or terminate it cleanly, which will allow you to get all the output you were expecting and complete whatever workflow you have AMass involved in. So I definitely recommend you use this instead. I mean, I would just let it finish personally, but depending on your target and the way their infrastructure is set up, since AMass does perform a exhaustive enumeration process, there's really no guarantee as to how long this could take. It'll take as long as it takes to finish the enumeration for everything that it found. So I can't give you a time period as to how long exactly that will take, because it's completely dependent on your target and your own network performance, like how many high performance resolvers you were able to give AMass and what your bandwidth is, things that are outside of our control when we're implementing this. All right, so that's kind of the long story for, or at least what I can fit within this training session for what happens inside AMass, and maybe to answer some people's questions about, so why does it take so much longer for AMass versus some of the other tools that are purely passive. One thing people ask me quite a bit, and I think is worth taking a quick look at, is the configuration file. So what I'll do, let's go back to our repo, because we have an example configuration file that you can start with. That's right here. And the link for it is right there. So hopefully it's not too hard for people to find out about it. But what is nice about this is a lot of the either defaults or you might say suggested values are in this example file. So it gives you an idea of what you're working with if you don't provide your own configuration, or in some cases it gives you ideas for what are reasonable values if you're going to set this up yourself. Well, it looks like there's a question. Let me see. Is there a way to timeout, or for timeout to make AMass pause? Or after using the timeout, will you have to start? Yeah. Okay, so good question. So the question was, is it just that it terminates it, or can it pause it and then we can pick it back up again? Or do you have to start all over again? So right now there's no implemented feature for pausing AMass. And the major reason being, I mentioned a moment ago how it's a cyclic process. So if we were going to support pausing, we would have to be able to take basically a snapshot of exactly what this cyclic process looks like when the indication comes in that it's time to pause. And if there was any activity going on that was on the wire or over the network, we'd either have to have a way of saying, well, when we resume, since that didn't finish yet, then we have to fire up all these requests again. Or we'd have to be okay with some of them being lost and only, say, preserving the ones that didn't yet get sent out. And even then, we'd have to have a way of saving all those. I guess the short version of what I'm trying to say is it would be almost a nightmare trying to keep track of all this, since there's so much happening at any given moment within AMass. So there's been plenty of people who have asked, could you implement pausing? And while I'm sure the answer is, well, technically, yeah, I'm sure it's feasible, it's definitely not been something we wanted to do, because it would be a lot of work. And honestly, I'm not really sure how many people feel the need to use it. So I haven't been able to gauge whether it's really worth going through all the trouble of implementing it. But one thing that perhaps would make people feel a little better about all this is when whatever amount of work you get that you accomplish during your enumeration. So let's say you said, okay, I only have time to do this for 1 hour, and then that's it. I got to go. Everything that is discovered during that period of time, though, is saved in a graph database, as long as you don't turn the feature off that I'm about to mention. So it saves all this in a graph database. And let's say when you then traveled somewhere else and got to where you needed to be and found yourself now in a position to fire this back up. If you fire it back up with the same target organization, it will take all the information that was discovered in your first enumeration, or for that matter, in any number of previous enumerations. It will take all that information and try to use it in your next enumeration, so that you don't lose anything that you already learned about previously. So, that helps. I mean, the only thing that's about that is it's still going to try to find all those things all over again, but at least you can be pretty sure that if you found it before, you're going to find it this time too. And one reason that's really nice, and part of the motivation for us implementing that, was that when we created the tracking feature, which is, I'll show you a little bit more about that in a minute, but it's what allows you to see what's changed from one enumeration to the next, and just get the highlights, like what's new, what has been removed, or what has moved within the infrastructure. It's kind of hard to do that if you don't have some way of ensuring that we have consistency from one enumeration to the next, you know, if each time you run it, each enumeration is kind of on its own, and you're hoping that they're going to come up consistent each time, it doesn't really work out that great, since every single time you do this, data sources could behave differently, the networks could behave differently. There's all sorts of reasons why you could come up with answers that are not exactly the same. Because again, this isn't just using data, you know, we're not just reaching out to databases and saying, please give me what you know about this, and then printing it out, which is what a lot of these other tools are doing. There's lots of factors that can cause a mass to get different results each time, especially since some of these methods that we use also employ random guessing. So, you know, one time you could get lucky and discover a name that, you know, the chances of you getting, you know, lucky the next time, it's hard to say exactly what it will be. But if it's saved, you could think of it as, we have it, so we're going to get it in the future. So I don't know if that answers the question exactly, but maybe it at least partially solves the problem of not having the pause feature. It looks like someone just asked, what's the optimum timeout value? Fair question, but as I mentioned earlier, really hard to say, since my answer would be it totally depends on your target. For instance, if you're doing it against, you know, OWASP.org like I was a moment ago, I would say, oh, well, maybe the optimum value is, I don't know, 5 to 10 minutes or whatever it takes to come up with the 18 different names, I think it is, that typically are discovered. But if you're doing it against, you know, yahoo.com or something like that, who knows, it could be 48 hours, or, you know, I don't know how long it tends to take to finish that entire namespace. But, and it depends on also, are you doing one domain name, or are you doing, say, all 20 or who knows how many that the target organization has registered? Because of course that's going to just add time to how long this takes. So I wish I had an answer for you, but yeah, I'm afraid I don't. It's one of these things that you'll have to feel it out, I suppose, if you're keeping your eye on a particular organization, whether that's because it's for, say, a bug bounty program, or because you're trying to protect that organization and you're monitoring its, you know, internet exposure. I think you'll just have to feel out what is normal for you know, what you're typically seeing happening with that organization, and then you're just going to have to kind of create your own configuration file that works well for you. That's what I would do. And it's what I have done for targets that I'm interested in. All right, so going back to the config file. So some of these options in here, while it's nice that they're available, I think I would say I actually find myself not using them very much. For instance, I think I rarely specify resolvers through my config file. You know, instead, I think I tend to keep a separate .text file that has a resolver IP address on each line, and I feed that into my command line interface. And I'll show you a little bit more about that in a minute. So there's some things you can do in here that just because you can, I'm not sure I would say that means that's what you want to do. But there are some handy things in here. Like, for instance, if you know, excuse me, that some of these data sources are just causing your process to take too long, and you're not generally getting many results out of them, or you know that a different data source always finds the same names, then take them out. You know, because they can add time to the overall, you know, the entire process. So if you know that they're not working for you, or again, you're feeling things out and you can kind of tell it's not doing you any good, then remove them. Or if you're just not comfortable using them, again, take them out. And this is a great way to do that. And so that you don't have to keep specifying it on the command line. Let's see. So brute forcing configuration options, these are pretty important. I'm going to talk a little bit more about them later though, so I don't want to spend too much time here about it. Same thing with alterations. But I would say if you really want to maximize on these features, get to know what these things mean. I actually think the user's guide currently summarizes this the best. But I also am pretty sure that we recently updated the repo wiki. And I think there's an entire section of the wiki that is dedicated to just configuration options. So that could be worth taking a look at if you're really dying to know about what, how you can tweak this to your needs. But usually probably the biggest reason everyone wants to use this file is because this is the only place, at least currently, where you can specify your API keys. And I don't know if it's the way I did this or what, but I feel like I get a handful of people coming to me saying they have trouble doing this. But so let me show you real quick, what this would look like if you opened this example file up and you said, okay, I want to add census to my enumeration process, which, by the way, it's already in there. It's just some of these don't work at all without a key. Some of them will kind of work without a key, but under very limited, conditions. And those with the key, you'll get maximum results. But in order for it to work, you have to remove these pound signs. So these are the comments, right? So currently these are commented out. But in order for this to get picked up by the program, this section name has to be not commented. This isn't just here for looks. It's just like the ones up here. Let me see. I'm not sure if any of these are okay, so this is the only section I'm seeing that is not commented by default in this file. But it needs to be there in order for the information to be discovered and for it to be treated as a unique API key with a name, which has to match the name of the data source that's going to use it. So it's really important. And the examples you see in here, some of them you'll see don't have the same attributes as all the other ones, right? And that's not coincidental or like, oh, well, we were just in the mood to call it something else one day. It's because for these that are already implemented, that's what these have to be called in order for the authentication information to be received properly by the AMass data source implementations. So I would say pay close attention to what these look like. Just uncomment them and then provide your key if it's a key, or your like username and password, so that they're received properly by the program. Now the other thing is, some of these have to be, I don't know if there's any examples of this in here. So another reason to mention it would be, you're probably better off putting whatever key you provide in quotes, just in the strange case that it has unusual characters that would be interpreted in a strange way by INI parsing. Your best bet is put it in quotes, and then it's just going to be treated as a string that will be passed as is to the program. If you decide to make your own scripts for AMass, there's nothing preventing you from adding your own sections in here, like I said, that match the name of your data source and providing your own key. So you can kind of like take full control of this if you want. There's also nothing preventing you from let me be careful about that. Now, in your script, the only data that will end up in the script that's related to the API keys is the ones that match the name of your script. So, because it will only map that into your script. All right. So enough of that. One more thing I get asked about a lot is, so AMass keeps a lot of this information somewhere. And people end up with a lot of questions about this. So we call this the output directory, but there's some pretty important things that happen in this directory. So if you don't specify anything related to the output directory, like in the case of this, let me move this up. So in the case of this right here, there's nothing about the output directory in here. So AMass will put it in the default location. So for Linux, that location is in this directory under AMass. So there's some important files that get created in here. There's the output that it's exactly the same as what ended up on standard out. It just gets saved into this file in case you decide, wow, that was really great. I wish I had that saved somewhere. Then it's right here. There's also a JSON version of that data, which has more data in it than is provided in standard out. There's also the log file, which I would say if you're having any trouble at all with AMass, you definitely want to check this file first, because there's a really good chance the answer to your question is probably in there. Of course, it's also it can get pretty large. So it's just like any log file. If you don't know what you're looking for, you might not find it. But I would say take a look at this and see if there's any indicators as to what happened in your situation. Also be prepared for the possibility that our team could say, please share your log file with us if you're going to come to us with like troubleshooting requests or anything like that. This file is the graph database. It's the default one that's saved locally on your machine if you don't tell it to use, say, a different graph database like a Gremlin server or something like that. So this is where a lot of the magic is happening. Also, if you decide to use any visualization features, this is the default directory where it drops the files for the visualizations. So some other magic that kind of happens in here that people seem to sometimes have trouble finding out about is, if you are comfortable using this directory or whatever output directory you want to use, you can just put your configuration file in here as long as it has the same name, config.ini, and it will just get used automatically. You won't have to tell AMass to use it. So that's pretty convenient. But if you would like to not put it in the output directory, you can just use that flag and point it to wherever the file is. But you can also change where the output directory is by using that flag. So if you don't want to use the default location, you can make any directory you want and then just use this to say, that's where I want the output directory to be. Which can be kind of handy if you'd like to keep the graph database specific to, say, a target organization that you're working with. You don't want all the results from all your enumerations mixed up in the same database. So I'd kind of recommend maybe coming up with a organization structure for this. The other thing too is eventually these graph databases will get larger if you're using one database for every single, target that you're ever pointing at. Okay, so a little bit more about the tool before we jump into some of the advanced features. So if you run this like that, it's pretty much going to give you this as its nice way of saying, well, what did you want me to do? Because, of course, it has no idea what you're asking for if you just put in the program name. But it will tell you, well, with just the program name, I can give you these things, or here are the subcommands that you have available to you. So the one that usually everybody's using, and you've seen me using, is the enum subcommand, but which is going to handle vertical domain name correlation. So you give it the domain names, and it's going to dig deeper to find you subdomain names and host names. But there are other features, some of which I've mentioned already, like tracking. So that this is where this is how you'd mention that or specify that. I unfortunately do not have time to go into each one of these and show you all the features that they support. Some of them are far simpler than others right now, enum being the one that has gotten the most attention. But depending on how you're using this, I would say this could be very helpful. For instance, some people in Bug Bounty have told me that it's been really helpful to have this so that when they're running a new enumeration, but they're only interested in learning about the new targets, that this saves them a lot of time. I would imagine that makes perfect sense to me. I think that's what I would be doing too, is saying, well, let's run another enumeration, and please only show me the things that I didn't already know, so I'm not wasting my time. The other one I would recommend people take a look at is the DB subcommand. So probably the nicest thing about this is, first of all, you could just tell it, well, show me everything that I know about it, or that AMass knows about a target. So for instance, you could say show, and then say OWASP.org. So that way, what that will give you is everything the database knows about that target. And a lot of people, I think, are quick to run the enum command and then just take the results and say, that's everything at my disposal. But depending on how many times you've run this enum command or against that target, and there's data in the database, running this when you're done could actually give you more, or a lot more, than what came out of the latest enumeration. Another way to do that, which perhaps would be easier for your workflow, would be you can just say, give me the names, and then again, just give it the domain name, and it will just give you a list of names that it knows about. You could also say, give me the names with the sources. If that's not useful to you, then just leave that out. I think a handful of people have told me that this is what they do when their enumeration is complete, especially if they're running the same enumeration periodically. I think that's the right thing to do. That's what I would do to make sure I'm getting all the information available. I know people have asked me, what is DNS? So what I would say right now is, don't worry about it too much, because we're not done implementing it. We're just getting started kind of with it. But what it will be, hopefully, when we're done with it, is a way for you to take a bunch of names that you already know about. So maybe you acquired them from other tools or or data sources that AMass doesn't have support for, or something like that. And if you provide those names to the DNS subcommand, it will resolve the names, making sure that they're legitimate or valid, and then add them to your database. So that way, it's like a quick way to insert them into the database after AMass makes sure that they're passing the test, so to speak. So it's not really a replacement, say, for any other tool that would be doing the DNS resolution for you. There's already good tools out there for that. It's really more related to how to use the AMass database as like one place of truth, or one place to be keeping all the findings that you're working with. Now, visualization is another one. It's kind of like track. There's a handful of things you can do with this that unfortunately I won't have time to go over all of them today. I would recommend you take a look at it. I've heard lots of people tell me, oh, when I first started using AMass, I only used enum, and I didn't know that visualization was an option. And then when they started using it, they said it was very beneficial. I'm a very visual person. I've supported the visualizations since this project first started, because I like to see what these organizations look like on the internet. I find it easier to dig into the infrastructure and find places that are of interest by looking at it, not just reading the names and the IP addresses. So what I can show you is real quick is that when your enumeration is complete, it's really just a matter of, just say viz, or let me show you real quick the options. So if your target is small, D3 would do the job. Like, I think it can handle somewhere between 500 and 1,000 nodes before you start overwhelming D3. The thing is, for a lot of people, their targets are far larger than that. So you, at that point, would probably need to use something like Gephi or Maltego if you want to start looking at much larger things. I kind of like Maltego, I think, just because I've used it for so long that I'm used to it, but Gephi is a really powerful tool as well. And Graphistry is an excellent tool, but I'm not sure how much you can use it for free. I'd have to look into that, and I don't want to speak on their behalf, but it's an extremely powerful tool, and it can handle the largest number of, the largest graphs of all the options that AMass has here. Like I said, I just don't know all the details of what it takes to be able to use it, but I'd say definitely look into it. I've used it for targets that, give me tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands of findings, and Graphistry has no trouble generating the visualizations. Okay, so the way that you would use this, though, is you specify your type of output, and then give it, again, the target, domain or organization. And what this will do is it will take the data that it knows about from, related to that target that's in the database that you're currently pointing to. So right now that would be the default one. If you know it's somewhere else, then you need to tell it that. And then when you run this, it puts it in that location I mentioned. Under a file, which is AMass underscore the name of the visualization, and then whatever, file type is appropriate for the output. So as you can see, we already have a D3 here. Now there's a Maltego. the way the data is consumed is based on the program that has to consume it, right? So with D3, it's just your browser with the HTML. With Maltego, of course, you have to have Maltego. If we go back to the types here, with this, you have to have the Gephi program. And even with that, I think you have to kind of tweak the settings to make sure it renders it the way you like. So anyway, you kind of have to play with the programs or the systems that make use of the data. The easiest one being D3, because you just open it in your browser and you're good. All right, looks like maybe we have some questions. So since AMass may yield different results at later times, could you discuss about using the AMass track subcommand? Can it be done before or after enumerating a target? All right, so you definitely have to use track after you've enumerated the target, and it has to be enumerated at least 2 times because it needs a before and an after. It needs to be able to say, what was it like before? What have we seen most recently? And how is it different? Because that's what it's doing really. It's tracking by saying, let me show you what changed from the last time. And let's say you have 5 different enumerations. It will take everything it knew from the previous 4 and then take the most recent one and tell you what's different. So well, I mean, exactly how it does that can be changed based on the options that you give it. I guess you could say most of the time when you're using it, you can think of it as it's going to tell you how this time was different than the last time. But there are ways to say, well, I'd like to know more than that. Like, show me, you know, how it's changed over the course of the time I've been monitoring it. And there's ways to ask it for more information about that. But generally, if you're just using the default values, it's just going to say, well, this is how the most recent enum is different than the last time. So you can get the highlights or the new information. All right, the question here was, is there a way to clear the database easily or remove the entries? That's a good question. So at this point in time, there's no way to just say, there's bad information, I want to take that out. We are going to implement that because we realize it needs to be in there. But right now you can't do that. You can't just say, for instance, like AMass DB and then remove and give it, say, a subdomain name or something like that. But we are going to. And we're also going to make sure that things that are dependent on that potentially get removed as well. So you would be able to specify like one bad thing, and then it would be able to say, right, but all these other things were discovered because of that, so let's get them out of here too, to kind of clean up. But you can't do that at this moment. Instead, you pretty much have the option of live with what's in there or get rid of it and start over. Or what I would probably do if I was concerned about, you know, this data being very important to me, is I'd make sure I back up the database each time I do another enumeration, so that it's kind of like a snapshot, which you could just do by copying the bolt file. Let me go back real quick. So this indexes.bolt file, you could just copy that and then do another enumeration. As long as everything came out pretty good, you could just leave it. But if there were, say, a lot of things discovered that you knew were false, you know, I'd say, well, then just replace the file with the backed up file and try again. That way you don't lose any good information that you've been holding on to, but you also don't have to live with all the, say, garbage that managed to get in. We will, like I said, be working on ways to do this better in the future. We just haven't been able to do the implementation yet. These are great things that if contributors want to come and help move these things along, I would say, please meet us at the Discord server. We'd be happy to talk. All right, I think we're making our way through this pretty good. Let's see. All right, so this is where I think I'd like, well, I already showed a pretty basic demonstration with OWASP. I think given, let's look at one thing real quick, since I sometimes get questions about this. So if I put this in, let's just fire it at the same target just because I don't want to have to worry about who we're revealing information on. Otherwise, I'd be happy to show you something larger. But some people have asked me, so like, what do some of these things mean? So I hope it's kind of clear. All these things up here only take place when the data source has received the request and it's ready to do the it's ready to do the query for what you're seeing here. So where this can be relevant is if you're giving it more than one domain and you're curious as to, well, when did it get to the point where it was ready to do, say, the third domain or one of the additional domains, this message is your indicator. Okay, it waited, it did the rate limiting wait, and it was now ready to ask this data source about this target. So that's why these show up. It's for your awareness in case you're watching this and you're curious, how far along are we through the process? I mean, there's no real way to just have a gauge that says this is the percentage that it's done, since it's a cyclic process that it's very hard to tell what could spike the activity, and it's dynamic. But this at least gives you an idea of, well, as far as getting through the data sources, it gives you an idea of how far along you are. All right, so for this information, hopefully it's somewhat clear, but I'm going to explain it all anyway. So this right here is a source, and it's only one source that found this name. But let me tell you, the chances are probably very good that it's one of several sources probably that found it. But since we're just trying to keep this clean, one of the sources is selected, and it's random for, this one found it. It could be based on timing. Like if this one just found it way faster than all the other ones, then you'll see something like this where a bunch of them show up under the same source because it's the only one that knows about it right now or found it so far. But later in the process, there could easily be other names where, say, 3 different sources found it, and this is just the one that happened to be picked to get credit for it, so to speak. But the graph knows about all of them. It's just that for output, we're only printing one. But this is the name, obviously, and then these are the IP addresses that this name resolved to. Now, let me mention here, these names could be C names. They could be aliases, and you're still going to end up with the IP addresses because AMass will follow the C names until the A records or the quad A records are discovered. So just because you see this name show up here and it has IP addresses does not necessarily mean that if you were to, do a dig on this name, that you're going to find that it has these exact same IP addresses as A records that it has. So just a heads up that it's trying to provide you with I mean, because if you were to use that name, that's where ultimately you're going to end up going. But if you want to know exactly what the, like, say the, you know, the records look like for this namespace, then you're going to probably have to do some of your own digging, because that's not the intention of what this output was designed for. There's also some other twists to this. Like, for instance, if the name was found using reverse DNS, it could have been found by doing reverse DNS on a different IP, because the one that shows up here is what happens when we have the IP address, we do the reverse DNS, we get the name, and now we've resolved the name forward, doing forward resolution, which creates the potential that you end up getting a different IP address for the forward resolution. So just some things that most of you, I imagine, probably don't care too much about, but if you're doing digging on the results, these things are likely to pop up, and it could cause you to say, why is this happening? So it could be helpful to know why. So also, every minute, or approximately every minute, you should get this message that comes up. This is pretty important, I would say. If you're watching your process, if this isn't just like in some workflow somewhere, you're going to want to know some things that pop up in here that show you could have problems. Like, for instance, if you're seeing it say that the average retries required is 100%, then it's not working. Maybe you knew that already, but some people haven't. They've come asking me what that means. It means that none of your DNS requests are successful, and it's retrying. It's doing nothing but retrying on all the names. So you have a problem with your resolvers, or your ability, or AMass's ability to reach the resolvers and things like that. Also, if you're seeing the average queries performed at 0, that can be fine for a little while at the end of the enumeration. It could just mean that it's kind of like wrapping things up, and it's got a few things that it's tidying up, and the DNS isn't, there's not a whole lot of DNS happening anymore. But what you should be seeing is something like, oh, there's 0 or 1 per second, and the average retries is 0%, or something like that. That just means it's tidying up the process, the enumeration, and it's about to be done. But if you're seeing things like that in the middle of the enumeration, then you have issues, or there's something wrong. If it's not staying at a pretty steady rate throughout the enumeration, like I said, until the end, then something's not right. And I mean, it could be that maybe you don't have enough resolvers, and the ones you're using are throttling you, or there's all sorts of network reasons, or reasons imposed by created by your network or the infrastructure that could be causing this. So I just wanted to mention some of these things. There are indicators that are printed out here that, again, if you know what these things mean, it could help you diagnose what's happening. I mean, I hope this is pretty straightforward, but this is just kind of convenience information. It tells you how many names were discovered across what types of data sources, and then it prints out where those names were found within the various ASNs, which can be helpful when there's more than one ASN. Like, for instance, a company that has its own ASN, and then it's using cloud resources and things like that. You're going to get these names spread across all sorts of networks. And these numbers can be a little interesting, because you could have, say, 100 names, but then the numbers, if you tally them up in here, could be more than that. But what you want to keep in mind is the way it works is when the name shows up, let's say it has 2 IPs, and that causes it to show up in 2 different networks, then that one name is actually going to cause 2, an increase in 2 total in this column. So don't be too alarmed if the numbers don't seem to match up perfectly. And then obviously at the end here, what this is saying is, okay, there's nothing more to do with the enumeration, and the reason it's just not, the program isn't finished yet is because it's moving the data into your database, which if that's local would probably be pretty quick. Again, it depends on how large your target was. If you were using a different kind of database, it could be dependent on the performance you have between where AMass is and where your database is, or how fast your database server is, things like that. Okay, so some of the more advanced features that what I find is a lot of people don't understand, know about these things, or they don't understand how they work, but I think are pretty important, especially for me, where I need this kind of control. Whether you do, I guess it depends on how you're using this, but I like to be able to have fine-grained control over what data sources am I asking to give me data during my enumeration, especially if I'm trying to make sure one of them is working right. So you can do that with this flag. So you can say, look, for this like test I'm running, I only want to know what this is saying. So you could say that. And you can really make sure that you're seeing exactly what that sends back if you do this. So that combination right there allows you to say, just show, don't do any other fancy stuff, just query that and tell me what comes back. So that can be pretty handy, especially if you're just doing, like I said, like a sanity check or something, and you just want to make sure that it's working for you. If you're going to not do it with passive, like you want to turn on, say, several of them, because that's just the way you wanted to run your enumeration process. Make sure you give it, there's a few of these that they're not turned on by default. Like I think we're going to fix this. There's a feature request in right now to address this, but right now, if you were to do this, it probably isn't going to show you anything, because you've told it to only include that data source, but there's no data sources to resolve the IP and infrastructure information, so like this, or like that. At least one of these needs to be in here in order for it to take the names that are found and then say, okay, well, tell me where that is, or tell me what network that's on. So these are just things that I find people coming to our Discord and asking because, I don't know, because I'm not sure if it's because they didn't look at the documentation, or if it's just because people don't talk about it much. But I think they're powerful features that it sounds to me like more people need to know about them. There's also an exclude option. So let's say you like all of them except for a few. You would just like to turn off a couple of them. Then you can do it using this. Well, I see some activity over here. All right, so it sounds like people want to know what Discord is the AMass Discord. So this should help right here. Okay, so where was I? All right, so include and exclude. I would say if that sounds like something that pertains to your needs, take a look at that closely. You'll probably be happy that you know about it and that get acquainted with it. Like I said, we're going to make some improvements on this. People have come and said, well, is it possible that you could make some of those data sources related to net, infrastructure default, or like they can't be turned off? Some people have said, well, what if for whatever reason, a name is resolved, but then you can't get the infrastructure information? Could you just print it out anyway and, not include the infrastructure information? That's a pretty good request, I think, and we're considering doing that pretty soon. So these are things that are kind of in flux right now. We'd probably be interested in hearing other people's thoughts about it as well. And it's a little bit to be determined. All right, moving along. So I feel like I get some questions about brute forcing quite a bit. I hope nobody minds that I'm demonstrating this stuff, but I don't want to sit here and waste a lot of time just staring at enumerations complete. So instead, what I'm trying to do here, I hope it's obvious, is I'm trying to show you how you can potentially use this, but I don't want to sit here and watch it brute forcing complete when I only have like 30 minutes left to speak with the audience. So what I'm going to show you is, so how can you get better control over this, so you understand how to make it do exactly what you want to do. So brute forcing is not on by default. It's optional, and frankly, it's because it slows things down quite a bit. It also uses a lot of memory because it causes a lot more names to be generated and have to be stored for a while and things like that. We try to keep this under control, but to some degree, how much memory is used depends on how much work you're making AMass do. But if you want to turn it on, you have to turn this flag on, or you have to turn the equivalent flag on in your config file, which is under the brute forcing section. You have to say active equals true. So, but there's some other pretty important things. If you turn this on, it's only using the word list that is default for AMass, and it's actually like embedded in the executable. So it's kind of magically using it and you don't realize it. But it's also pretty small. I think it has maybe like 2,000 words in it. So obviously not the one you probably want to be using if you're really, really trying to take advantage of this. So what you do is you use -W and point it to your own word list. So that's great. Then you can, you've turned brute forcing on, and now you've said, okay, use my preferred word list. And of course, I'm sure you're aware of all the various reasons why you definitely want to have your own word list, whether it's because you just want to feel like you've got as many words as possible, or whether it's because the words are relevant to the target organization and you think it's increasing your odds. There's lots of great reasons to tweak your word list. But the other thing to note, though, about AMass is that it does recursive brute forcing. And that is on by default when you turn brute forcing on. So you can either turn it off if you just don't like that idea, or you can use it, but I would recommend you consider how it's controlled. So what I mean by that is, out of the box, if you just throw that flag on, you're getting recursive brute forcing, but it's only going to do the recursive brute forcing on a subdomain if it has seen a label off of that name. So what does that mean exactly? So let me show you. If I can see if I can just fire this up. Make it small enough. All right, I'll go back to So the flag I'm talking about that controls this is called min for recursive, and the default value is 1. So what that means is if you if you leave it like that, it's going to do brute forcing on the root domain no matter what. Like that's just going to happen right away. But for recursive brute forcing to kick in, you'll need to see a certain amount of names show up. And this is what I mean by that. So let's say there was a subdomain, we'll call it AMass at OWASP.org. So if you only found that, if that's the only name that you discovered, it would not start recursive brute forcing on the subdomain amass.owasp.org, because it would say, well, the number of labels we've seen off of AMass is 0. So we're not going to start recursive brute forcing. But when later in the process it finds www.amass.owasp.org, it's now going to say, oh, well, we've now seen 1 label off of amass.owasp.org, and the minimum for recursive is 1. So let's start recursive brute forcing for amass.owasp.org, and it will begin. So the question could be, well, what if you don't like that behavior? Like, what if that's not what you had in mind? If your desire was, I want to brute force every single thing that gets discovered, then what you probably want to do is change this value to 0 so that it immediately begins brute forcing on every name it finds. I wouldn't recommend doing that unless that's definitely, that's exactly what you wanted, because you're going to get a whole lot of activity for things that aren't going to yield results, because it's going to try that for names where it has no evidence that this is an actual subdomain name that has other names hanging off of it. But it's going to try it anyway because you told it to, and you'll definitely end up waiting a lot longer. So I've found that 1 is a nicer number to work with, but you also could find yourself saying, yeah, but I really don't, since so many subdomains have www, dot whatever the subdomain is, dot, root domain, I don't really like 1 either. Maybe that's not enough. I'd like to see 2 or 3. Okay, well then change it to 2 or change it to 3. Whatever works best, like I said earlier, for your target is really what you should pick. And these things can be put into your config file, so that way you only have to figure this out and go through the trouble of specifying it one time, and then you could stop worrying about it. But I definitely say learn, remember what these things mean and use them properly. Unfortunately, that's about as much as I have time for with brute forcing, at least for what that means to AMass. I mean, you could argue that alterations is a type of brute forcing, but we break up the 2 features in AMass. Name alterations are on by default. So if you don't want them, you actually have to turn them off, which I'm pretty sure that's the switch. Yeah, no alts. So if you say no alts, then it's not going to do it. Oh, that's not what I wanted. Oh, nice. All right, so if we leave them on, there are some powerful configuration options related to it. So most of them, though, are also on by default. And I would say, unless you know for a fact that it's generating a lot of attempts and it's not really yielding anything for you, I would say just leave them on. But if that's the case, if you know that it's a problem, you can turn them off in your config file. We ran by these earlier. They're in the config file, and they have Boolean values, right? So you could just say, I don't want to do number flipping, or I don't want to add numbers. You could turn those two things off and then still leverage the other types of alterations. The big one, though, that I think causes the most confusion, because those are easy, right? It's easy to understand what those mean, I think, and then just say, if you want them off, then turn them off. But there's one in there called edit distance, and its default value is equal to 1. And I can completely understand how most people would probably say, I don't know what that means. And so here's as quick as I can describe it, what that means. So there's a process under name alterations. It's called, actually, let me see if I can just show it. Well, it's not really, it's not worth it since we're running out of time here. But there's a fuzzy algorithm in the alterations implementation where it takes the resolved names and it says, well, let's just change them a little bit. So what that means is it adds characters and numbers in various locations, or pretty much in every single location within the name, or at least it's the host name, not the whole entire name. And it'll add numbers. It will delete characters from the resolved name, and it will take characters and substitute them for other characters. So it just kind of makes little changes to them to try and see if similar names exist. And the edit distance is, well, how many times will it make these changes to a single resolved name before it says, okay, that's enough, and then stop, and move on. The default is 1, so it just means it's only going to do that. It's only going to take the original resolved name and then attempt those things one time, and then that's it. If you change that to 2, what you're now saying is, so make the change and cycle the result back into the process and do it all over again. And it creates a huge increase in the number of names generated. And they end up attempting names that are less similar. And you could do this quite a few times, number of times by changing that edit distance value, but I wouldn't recommend it, because once you start getting, past like 3, the number of names it's generating is unbelievable. So I wouldn't recommend you do it, but that's what that is. If you change the value to 0, you will cause that algorithm to not be used. So maybe that's the most important piece of information in what I just shared with you, is that if you don't like having that included in your name alterations, then just make it 0, and then you don't have to worry about it. I kind of like that process. I think it's pretty powerful what sometimes gets discovered. So I like just leaving it at 1 and seeing what happens. So that's that. The next thing I wanted to cover before then I try to use the rest of the time maybe introducing you to our new scripting engine is, I get a lot of questions about how to manage your DNS resolvers. So by default, AMass has, I think it's something like 8, either 8 or 10 default DNS resolvers that it uses, and they're pretty high performance. Like they're they'll handle quite a lot of requests and with pretty low latency. It is not your DNS resolver that you've specified in your OS. So sometimes this, causes confusion for people. They'll come to us and say, well, if I do dig on my machine, I can get my machine to resolve that name. But then when I try to do it with AMass, it doesn't work. Why isn't it working? And the reason often ends up being because AMass is using different DNS resolvers, and they have blocking going on for using any DNS resolver other than their default one, or the one that they're using in their home or their place where they work and things like that. So something to keep in mind is that if you want DNS to use the same resolver that your system is using, then you need to tell it to. And you can do that by either specifying it with -r and then just giving it the IP address. You can put this information in your config file. You can create a text file with resolvers and then give it the RF flag and the name, path to the file, which is what I find myself doing a lot of times for a different reason that I'll go over in a second. But I would definitely say, make sure you are aware of where is AMass actually going and trying to find out about these names. Like where is it doing the DNS resolution or sending the queries to? The other thing is those default resolvers that it's using, you're only going to be able to pound on those so long before you're going to start to get problems potentially. I mean, for instance, one of them is Google, which is extremely high performance, and they're usually pretty good about, letting you do whatever query whatever you want. But eventually, if you keep doing it long enough and it at an intense level, Google will start to wonder what's happening. And you'll start getting interesting behavior from Google services and things like that. So personally, I wouldn't recommend you use those default resolvers if you're really gonna, say, do some intense brute forcing or start cranking up the alterations, or you just have a huge target and this is gonna last a long time. I would use a handy little tool. I'll show you what it is. If we go here, so I would go to this project here, and honestly, what I do is I just fire up the Docker image. It's extremely easy. And I would also say, I mean, they're being conservative here, in my opinion. I think they're just trying to be careful that they don't get you in trouble. But I have been able to change this number to something more like 100 or 200, and the difference in performance is unbelievable, because this right here is a huge number of name servers. And if you keep it at 20 threads, it could take a long time for this to finish. I would say fire that up to 100 or something like that, and it'll finish in like, I don't know, 5 or 10 minutes. And then you're going to end up with this file called resolvers.txt, which is probably going to have somewhere between 8,000 and 9,000 public DNS servers to work with. So at that point in time, what I do, actually we'll just bring it over here, is I take the resolvers file and I say, give me like 50 of them. And then I usually create another one called something like that. Because you do not need thousands of resolvers, or you shouldn't. I can't imagine why you would. You might need 100 or 200 or something like that, but for most of what I do, 50 is a pretty good number. You said, what's the GitHub page? All right, hold on a second. Unfortunately, I think I just dropped that, but I can find it easy enough. Oh, someone else already put that in there apparently. Anyway, there you go. No, that's a really good project. You should have that in your toolkit. Like I said, it's also so easy to work with it because they have the Docker image. That way, you basically have to worry about two commands: build me the Docker image and run the command just like they have it there. As I said, I would change the number of threads. It just makes it run faster. Once you get the information though, like I said, at least with AMass, I would say do not try to use thousands of resolvers. and let me tell you the biggest reason why. Because some of them are still not going to be good. So that DNS validator is a great tool, but it will still miss some that are going to give you false information. And it only takes one bad egg to then throw off your enumeration, which is really irritating. So I would really say cut it down to like 25 or 50 or something to increase the chances that the ones you selected from the pile end up being legitimate ones or good ones. And it just isn't really worth trying to use more, because moving along, if what I wanted to show you is, let's say you now have that file. You have this file called 50resolvers.txt. When you use AMass with the enum, so you're going to give it your usual stuff, and you're going to say, yeah, I want to brute force and all that, and then you're going to say, okay, so now you're going to give it 50resolvers.txt to the RF flag, and then whatever target you're going after. But there's one more catch, or one more thing. So you've got 50 resolvers at your disposal now instead of 8 or 10 or whatever it is. But it's still going to have the default number of DNS queries that are allowed to be happening at the same time, which that default that AMass uses for that number is based on the fact that it's assuming it's going to use 8 or 10 resolvers. And also just that this number is a bit dependent on your own network performance. Like, some people want the number to be low because they say their bandwidth can only handle so many of these requests going out at once. So maybe you'll be forced to always keep the number low. But for instance, a number that works pretty good for me, if I have 50 resolvers, is, so if I change it to its max DNS queries is the flag, and there's similar named things in your config file, so that you could change this permanently. But I kind of like 20,000 as the number. That combination works really good. 20,000 DNS queries that can be happening in any given moment across 50 DNS resolvers. That tends to give me some pretty good results, where during your enumeration, you could be seeing like 15,000 DNS requests per second. You start playing with the numbers too much, or you start, like shifting those numbers around a whole lot, and you can quickly start seeing the performance you're getting change or go downhill. So feel free, of course, to play with it, but it's a bit of there's a little bit of magic, I think, going on with what creates the best situation. All right, unfortunately, I'm kind of running out of time here. But that's a pretty important topic. I mean, personally, I've played with that for quite a long time, and it can have quite an impact on whether this ends up taking 48 hours to complete, or whether it ends up happening while you're eating dinner. So I'm gonna skip any additional details about visualizations. I went over it a little bit. It's a fun topic. I would say play with it. It's great. But I'd like to have a moment to show you, at least, or introduce you to our scripting engine. So a couple quick things. One is just a reminder. So by default, this is where the magic happens, right, with output and things like that for AMass. But another little hidden thing here is that if in this directory you create another directory, call it scripts, AMass will look there automatically, and it will look for ADS, or AMass data source scripts, and it will attempt to load them up as additional data sources in your enumeration. These scripts are Lua scripts. They're kind of similar to Nmap, NSE scripts. So there's like I said at the beginning, there's a whole documentation file on, so what are these, and how do you write them, and things like that. And actually, it's a bit of a work in progress. I would say be prepared for the possibility that we will be expanding it, maybe even changing things a little bit as we keep moving forward with it. But it's quite powerful that you could just have, say, your own database where you're keeping some of this information, and you just want the ability to pull what's in there into your AMass enumerations, and now you can. And you don't have to ask us to make it possible for you, or share any of that with anybody else. Or it could be as simple as you write one of these scripts to pull data out of a file or something. That it could be anything that you can do in this Lua environment, which is quite a bit actually. You can do these in your ADS scripts. So what I was going to say is, let's just look at one of these. Fire this back up. I guess I should have just kept this open. So if you're in the repo, the place where we currently have these is under resources and scripts, and they're broken out by the type of data source that it is. So as an example, under this, there's only one right now because it's the implementation for our brute forcing. And every one of these scripts has to have these two global variables that are the name, which needs to be unique across all the script names, and this type, which should be one of the, actually it could be anything you want to call it, but if you're hoping that it participates well with the rest of the AMass process, it really should be one of the types that's indicated or shared in the documentation. But then the rest in here is, a lot of it is what you want to do with it. Now, these here, and again, this is in the documentation, these are special function names, and they're callbacks. So so is this one down here. So these are like events that take place inside of AMass, and when those events happen, they let the data sources know about it in hope that the data sources will receive the information and then come up with more information. It's part of that cyclic process I mentioned earlier. So these are the events, and then, for instance, in this data source, these are like support routines that are just helping it do its job. So this is a fairly, well, I mean, actually, this is somewhat complicated. Let me show you one that is extremely simple, just to give an idea of how easy these can be to write. Like a pretty typical one. Actually, let's look at scraping. There's some good ones in here. So, so for this one, the only thing it has is a name, a type. It has a start routine in order to set the rate limit so that it doesn't call on this service more than once a second. And then all it does is take the name and do this client HTTP request and send it to this function that handles that and scrapes the results. And then it just has this function down here that says, build me the URL that's based on the data source and the domain name. But that's it. You know, it just says, where do I go to find this stuff? And then it sends it to scrape, and scrape does the client HTTP request and scrapes the response for not just for that domain name, but actually it scrapes it for any domain or subdomain name that is in scope for the enumeration process. So it's kind of convenient that it kind of does a lot of the legwork for you. But that probably represents what I would say is one of the simplest scripts that is available by default inside of AMass. But it can be just as easy for you to write your own. Someone said, can you make it list out C names that it finds as well as where it eventually resolves to? Yeah, so let's see, let's take a step back. I'll just go back to brute forcing for a minute. So if you look in here under resolved, there's some types of responses that I guess you could say they're not good enough to kick off brute forcing. So you can see in here, we say, well, first of all, we better have some records, and or if it has a CNAME record or doesn't have A records, essentially, or A or quad A records, then just leave, because it means this isn't what we want in order to kick off recursive brute forcing. But so the question was, well, could you have it list out CNAMEs? List out is a bit of an interesting question or idea, because AMass isn't really designed to let you customize the output. So you'd probably have to think about, well, so what do you want to do with the output? There's nothing preventing you currently, at least in these scripts, from just saying print what you want. Like you can literally just write print and then give it a string and it will print it out. So I suppose, at least at this point in time, you could create your own output and maybe tag it or something so that you know how to parse it out, and there's nothing preventing you from doing that. But I'm not sure how you would, if you're trying to do it within AMass, the AMass typical output that it provides. I don't know if there's an easy way to say, here's a name, and it looks like it could be of interest because it's a CNAME and points to something that isn't registered anymore, or something like that. If that's where you're going with this. But anyway, the sky's the limit, kind of. And you can obviously, by using this records argument or parameter here, you can do quite a bit, actually, to try to understand, well, this name, what was it, or how did it get discovered? You know, is it a CNAME? Is it? And the other thing too is right now there's a somewhat limited list of record types that AMass looks for, but I think you'll find that there's a feature request to extend that, which I'm very, you know, in favor of, because I'd love to see other DNS record types be something you could ask it to investigate for you as part of your enumeration. And when that does get implemented, those other types of records would show up in this parameter. So you could ask AMass to look for those things, and then your script could say, well, I'm interested in knowing when they're found. He said, was specifically about the brute force, just to include it in the results set. Yeah, I mean, I'm not sure what you mean, but the reason that we do not acknowledge the CNAMEs is that, so the chances that you adding labels to a CNAME and it finding additional, like, legitimate names is kind of low, maybe not impossible, but that's why we take those out, is that it's trying to make sure that this is an actual subdomain name, like a proper subdomain name that will have, you know, potentially many labels off of it to be discovered. And in the past, when we didn't check for things like that, it was a bit of a, like, we didn't like the results. But it brings up an interesting point. There's nothing stopping anyone that uses this from writing, say, their own brute forcing script. That's part of why I love having this engine, is so this is our default brute forcing script, but you could write your own and just give it a different name, and you could not use this one, or use it and also use yours that maybe does something just a little differently. Same thing with the name alterations. Like, you could have an idea for your own name, you know, your own way of permuting the names, and you could add it in. And that way, maybe you could feel like you're getting more complete, you know, coverage of all the things you want to attempt against the targets. That's why we created this engine, is so that now the sky's the limit. You could do anything in these scripts, including running other tools that also do this kind of activity, like subdomain enumeration, and then just take the results from those tools and feed them into this process, so that you can take full advantage of the cyclic process and the fact that all the results are getting saved in one place. All right, so I'm out of time, but I did get a chance to hit a lot of the topics I wanted to hit here. The only thing I wanted to add is please thank Quanterion for making it possible for me to attend this. They supported me being here, and they are definitely in support of how important asset discovery is to your security program. Also, like I kind of mentioned earlier, if you want to participate in this project, please come to our Discord server. We'll be happy to talk about just about anything with you that relates to AMass. And that goes for becoming contributors. And also, if you have any questions about things you think are wrong, say with the project or the tool, I would recommend come to the Discord server first. Let's talk about it, and then if we can conclude it definitely is a bug or something like that, we'll put in the appropriate issue or like feature request or whatever is relevant to the discussion. All right, thank you very much. I hope this was valuable to everyone. see. Is there someone that's going to conclude or jump in?
Yeah, definitely. I can jump in.
Okay.
So thank you, Jeff, for doing this. We really do appreciate that. There are some additional questions. Feel free to drop them into the Track One Red team. Currently on Twitch and all of the streaming platforms, we have our closing ceremony. So if you want to tune into that, please feel free and do so. But for now, we're going to go ahead and end the broadcast and end this particular webinar. And thank you all for joining.